Hi everyone, my name is Erik Adler, and today I want to read the second half of the first chapter from my first novel, White Lights, to you. Last time I read the first half of this chapter, which is called The Island of the Blessed, telling about Richard, who is waking up in this fantasy world. He meets an old Chinese man who sends him to an island where he meets 7 beautiful sisters. The youngest of them is called Aigle. That's the first one he meets there, and she makes him a coat out of the lion's fur that he found on the shore where he met this old Chinese. He also meets the oldest sister, who is called Eurothea, and she apparently is suffering from a deep depression, and Aigle complains that Eurothea, her oldest sister, refuses to eat from the tree, which makes her grow old. The other sisters apparently are all immortals. They don't grow old because they eat from this tree. And then she says she will take Richard to this tree, which grows in the middle of an orchard above terraces with flowers there, the garden of these sisters outside their house on this island. And now we'll come to the second half. These chapters are divided further into sections, and this is a fourth section called The Attack. The 5 women were lying around the stone table, eating the fruit and drinking from the glass jugs. They called out happily to Richard and Aigle, praising Aigle for her work on the coat. The new intimacy between their sister and the stranger did not seem to trouble them. Aigle led Richard to the tree. The apples were not yellow, he now saw, but golden. "Eat from the tree of life, Richard." Richard hesitated. "I think I'd rather let it be," he said. "But it will give you eternal youth." "I'm not sure whether eternal youth would be a blessing," he said. "Whoever lives forever remains the same." "Now you're talking like Eurothea," Aigle shouted. "Richard, please, eat from the tree." "No," he said firmly. "But then you will grow old." "Yes," he said, looking into her wide open eyes. "And that's okay." Aigle lowered her head. Slowly she went to the edge of the orchard and looked out over the terraces and the sea. Suddenly she cried out. The other women sprang to their feet and ran to their sister. Richard followed them. At the rocks below were hundreds of small shapes slowly moving up the mountain side. Now all the women were screaming with fear. They were touching Richard, looking up at him, desperation in their eyes. "Who are they?" he asked. His throat was so dry that he could barely produce the words. "The dwarfs from the underworld, the servants of our father," Aigle whispered, with her arms around his neck. Her sisters were already running towards the house. Aigle remained, pressing herself against his chest, sobbing. Richard wanted to lift her up and flee with her, for the odds were overwhelming. What could he do against hundreds of angry dwarfs? Soon they would reach the lowest terrace. They wore torches, although it was not yet dark. Some carried barrels on their backs. What did they want? The 5 women appeared again, with long silver bows and a quiver on each side. There could be no more thought of escaping. They were determined to defend their house and the garden with their lives. The attackers had reached the first terrace. They did not move further up, instead they spread out on the plateau. The ones carrying barrels removed them and poured the contents over the flowers. Others threw their torches. Suddenly the lowest terrace was a sea of flames. Thick black smoke rose. The bows were singing and a few of the dwarfs fell. Those who came after ignored the first terrace and their dying comrades, storming up the stairs and onto the second terrace. Now Richard could see them more clearly. Gaunt, with thin arms and legs, dressed in simple sleeveless jackets like uniforms. Their bald heads were enormous compared to their small bodies. Their eyes were constantly blinking, as if they were unable to stand the sunlight, and again they were colliding with each other. A few of them fell over the edge down to the next terrace and into the flames, shrieking in shrill voices like those of children. Soon the second terrace too was on fire. Everywhere dwarfs were falling, pierced by the women's long arrows. Those lying on the ground were shaking convulsively and did not get up, even if having been hit in the arm only. The heat and the bitter smell of the burning bushes could be felt even in the orchard. The dwarfs reached the third terrace. Soon the yellow and orange flowers too were on fire. On the stairs there were piles of wounded, but the sisters shot quickly and with astonishing precision. The uninjured climbed like monkeys over the lying ones. Now he could see their faces in more detail. In their foreheads and chins were deep furrows. They held their thin lips pressed together. There was no leader and no orders were given. They all seemed to have been trained perfectly for the work of destruction. Richard was petrified, unaware of the club in his hand. Eigle was clinging to him, weeping. Now he saw that the rest of the women too were crying. The plateau with the pink and apricot-colored flowers was destroyed. Now only the last terrace remained, then the dwarfs would fall over them. Richard grabbed the club harder. He could not leave these women, who had had such high hopes for him. And Eigle, she was still crying bitterly, her eyes closed. Soon she would be dead, and she would never laugh again. Then the dwarfs had arrived on the top terrace and were pouring the liquid onto it. The silver bows clanged, the attackers were falling, but the white flowers too went up in flames. The roaring of the fire was deafening. There were cascades of big yellow flames. The wind brought the smoke. Richard's nose and eyes went sour. The women were aiming downwards, waiting. Eigle had stopped crying. Like evil spirits, the dwarfs emerged from the smoke, eyes glittering red, their faces hard and unyielding. Without a word, they drew long daggers and rushed at the defenders. Richard's body acted on its own. His arm let go of Eigle. Both hands gripped the club. It hissed through the air and landed on the first attacker's skull. He could hear the bone bursting, and the dwarf collapsed. The club rose again and hit the next one straight in the face. With a crunch, the creature's jaw shattered, teeth flying out. The blow threw the dwarf down the steps. He lay still, blood oozing from his nose and mouth. The first attacker's body was rolling down the stairs, coming to a halt at the feet of two of his fellow combatants. Before Richard could take another swing, 3 of the creatures rushed past him. Warm blood splattered his eyes, that of the loveliest and most beautiful persons he had ever known. This is the end, he thought, wiping the blood off his face, expecting a knife blade in his back or in his belly at any minute. When he could see again, he realized that the dwarfs had already reached the orchard. For the moment they seemed to avoid him. They steered clear of him, instead hunting down the remaining women who were now running screaming across the open space in front of the house. When they fell, sobbing and in pools of their own blood, several of the attackers rushed at them, and the glittering yellow blades rose and fell over the victims. Richard felt sick. There was a buzzing in his ears and he had to cough. And where was Eigle? Section 5. Flight. He saw her step onto the well, her dress soiled and torn, blades of grass in her hair. With a few quick steps he was behind her, grabbing her waist and pulling her down. She screamed and squirmed, trying to free herself. The dwarfs quickly approached, daggers raised. Richard lifted the tall girl, who was hammering her fists at him in panic, threw her over his shoulder and ran towards the front door of the house. From the corners of his eye he saw the tree of life blazing. Eigle lay still. Steps behind him told him that the pursuers were closing in. He ran past one of the women lying in the grass, terribly dismembered. He could hear her moaning. 5 of the attackers were blocking the way. He turned and rushed towards some rocks behind the orchard. He reached the stones, rounded them, and continued down a hollow in the mountainside. Then he stopped, knelt down, let the slender body sink to the ground, and turned to face his pursuers. But he had misjudged the distance. There were just 3 of them, standing at the rocks, screaming out their hatred of him in their falsetto voices. But they did not follow. He picked up the girl again and hurried on. Eigle hung like a sack over his shoulder. On the side of the mountain the forest grew higher up. Richard reached the trees. They were no longer visible from above. Exhausted, he fell to his knees and let Eigle slip into the grass. He took her head between his hands. Eigle was conscious. She was staring at him as if she couldn't realize what had just happened. Richard let go of her, leaned against a tree, breathed deeply, and listened. Nothing. He looked around the trunk. There were no pursuers. He was sweating and the fur coat stuck to his bare skin. His heart was pounding. He longed for the waterfall in the wonderful garden, the garden that was no more. He had left the sack in the orchard, but there had been no time to fill it up anyway. He waited a few moments, then he picked up the apathetic girl again and continued on his way, a little slower this time. There was a light coming from higher up on the mountain. The dwarfs had set fire to the house. Richard's thoughts went to the sick Asian woman. She would hardly have been able to leave the house in time. He had done nothing for her, nor for the other women. A sense of powerlessness came over him. After having stopped and listened again, he gently put down Eigle on her feet. He had to support her. Eigle, can you hear me? She did not seem to understand. He put his arms around her. There was no reaction. Come with me, he said, looking her in the eyes. She nodded. He took her hand. They half walked, half ran down the mountainside. They reached the shore. Before them lay the sea and the horizon. There was no other land. They remained near the edge of the forest. Even here Richard could feel the smell of the fire. They found the small rowing boat. He led Eigle out into the open. The warm water on his skin soothed him a little. Agle stood by the boat, looking helplessly out at the sea. It hurt him to see her like this. The cheerful, naive girl who had laughed at his shame had been reduced to a shadow. He went and stood beside her, looking in her direction. Far, far away on the horizon there was a dark spot. Agle, can you see it? She nodded. What is it? Land. Another island. He reached for the boat. There was something lying on the bottom. He stared in confusion. It was the sack. It was full. There was no time for reflection. He pushed the boat into the water and helped Agle getting in. He gave it a push, climbed in and sat down. Agle did not look around. High above, he saw the burning house like a huge campfire. He still hoped the Asian woman had escaped the flames. He reached for the oars. The boat moved away from the beach. Section 6. Alone. Richard handed Agle the sack. She took it but did not drink. She was looking right through him. He tried to ignore the pain in his back and shoulders and peered at the island. It was still far away, but the distance was not as great as he had thought. Obviously, the island was very small. He felt a fresh breeze on his face. The wind was blowing towards their destination. The small boat did actually seem to move faster, but it also began pitching, the prow and the stern going up and down. Water was splashing over the railing and soon they were both soaked. In her thin gown, now almost transparent and sticking to her skin, her wet hair in her face, Agle was prettier than ever. After a while, Richard gave up on rowing. He made him and Agle change places, crawling through the water on the bottom of the boat. She obeyed without a word. Then he used one of the oars to steer. In the back of the boat he had a clear view of the island, and his heart sank. It was just a large cliff with a few trees. Gradually the waves grew higher and roaring cascades of water were thrown into the boat. Richard's club was drifting on the surface, shining in the afternoon sun. There was nothing to scoop with except the leather sack, and it was still half full of drinking water. Before them lay something looking like a small bay. However, it was just an indentation in the cliff. As he tried to steer towards it, the oar broke. The next wave tore the remaining oar out of his hand. There was nothing else to do but to await the end. He fell to his knees, looking up at Agle. She stared blankly at him. He took the sack from her and put it inside his coat. Then he stretched out his arms towards her. Slowly she sank down to him. He pressed her to him, laying down on the side. The cold seawater covered them, but left their faces free. She was trembling. He kissed her wet cheek. Just as he thought their little vehicle was going to sink, the roar of the waves disappeared, and the boat stopped pitching. They must have slipped into the bay. Then they struck against a rock. The prow rose, Agle slipped from his arms, and the sea closed over his head. He broke through the surface. On the shore stood a tree, the branches leaning down into the water. Agle was clinging to one of them. The boat was floating not far away, the bottom side up. He swam to her and helped her the last few meters to a short, stony beach. As they got out of the water, he remembered the sack. He must have lost it at the fall. He looked out of the small bay, but the sack was nowhere to be seen. Agle stood shivering beside the tree, head low. On her shoulders she was wearing big silver clasps in the form of a ring. He opened one of them, and the fabric slipped down a little, exposing one of her breasts. He removed the second clasp, but the dress did not fall off. It stuck to her body. He reached for it and carefully pulled it down. She did not move. The gown lay like a blue blanket around her feet. When he started unbuttoning his coat, she sank to her knees before him. But instead of reaching for him, what he had hoped for a millisecond, she lay down on the grass and closed her eyes. With a trace of disappointment, Richard got rid of his coat. Then he stood looking down at the naked girl, excited and stiff. He sat down beside her, careful not to make any sound. After some hesitation, he very gently touched her lower legs, brushing away the seawater. Then he let his hands wander along her thighs up to her hips. As he stroked the inside, she began to moan softly. He imagined her taking his hand, leading it to her lower abdomen, but her arms remained motionless at her side. He stroked her stomach up to her ribs, avoiding her small breasts. Somehow he felt ashamed to touch them. When she was dry except for those places he had been avoiding, he lay down beside her, looking at her. Her breathing grew deeper, and soon she was asleep. Now that there were no more immediate danger, his hunger returned, tearing at his guts. Finally he got up. After a last look at the sleeping girl, he left her to explore the island. The trees were very old. There were cracks and holes in them, and the roots were almost as thick as trunks, winding like serpents on the ground. Between them he discovered blue berries, big as rose hips. If there were berries, there had to be a well somewhere. He gathered a handful and ate them while walking. It staved off some of his hunger. Soon the trees gave way and he saw the cliff. There were a few seabirds taking flight, screaming as he approached. The top of the cliff was formed like a ledge. He climbed up and looked back. The island measured about 200 meters in diameter. He saw the small bay where they had landed. The place where Agle lay was out of sight. The storm had subsided. A fresh wind was blowing. In the distance, the island of the Blessed was clearly visible, gloomy and menacing. Richard could see the fire near the top of the mountain. The house was still burning. He could not discover any other land, but the fire gave him an idea. If they would succeed in lighting a fire here on the cliff, they might attract the attention of a ship. He remembered the beginning of the attack, how the dwarfs had been clashing against one another and falling down the terraces. Their eyes were too weak to discover a fire that far away, he told himself. And if he and Agle were able to feed on berries, edible leaves, and birds' eggs, they might survive until they were saved. With somewhat more confidence, he left the cliff and walked back through the little forest. On the way, he ate some more of the berries, gathering a handful for Agle. On the beach, he found only her blue dress and his fur coat. The berries fell from his hand and disappeared in the grass. He peered in all directions, but she was nowhere to be seen. He called out her name, but only the whistling in the leaves answered him. He rushed through the forest to the opposite shore. Nothing. Nor did he find her in the bay. The rowing boat had disappeared. Probably the waves had driven it back to sea. Then he froze. There was something lying on the ground at the water's edge, something that he had believed to be lost, the sack. He stared at it for a while. Then, reluctantly, he picked it up. It was full. He pulled the plug, raising the sack ironically towards the island of the blessed, put it to his mouth and drank. Wonderfully clear, cool spring water. Finally he returned to the cliff and stood there looking at the green waves breaking against the rock. He wanted to hurl himself into the sea, but he could not. He sank to his knees and covered his face with his hands. The day had turned brighter. He removed his hand from his eyes. The sun had broken through the clouds. Its rays made the water glitter. The light dazzled him, and in it he saw her face, smiling happily, like when they had first met, at the waterfall in her garden. Then he knew. She was still alive, and he could find her. He went to collect wood. Soon he had a heap of dried branches, but how make a fire? The coat. He went to the beach and brought it back to the cliff. It was still wet, but the sun had dried the outer hairs. He found an especially dry branch, tore it in half, and put the one half on the ground, pulling hair from the coat and placing it next to the wood. Then he began rubbing the second half against it. Soon his hands were aching and the sweat was flowing down his spine. Behind him the sun sank into the sea. Finally the wood began to smoulder and there was some smoke. Richard's heart made a leap. He rubbed even more intensely and then the first glow appeared. With the hair he fed the little flame, adding leaves and then a few branches. He lay down on his stomach and breathed on it. When the night came, Richard was standing in front of a blazing fire, delighting in the heat and the superiority of the human spirit. He, a city dweller, had defeated nature, had re-established civilization on this piece of rock in the middle of the ocean. He stretched out on the warm stone, looking up at the silent stars. The flames could be seen for miles. Sooner or later they must come, and he, Richard, had called for them.